How is everybody doing? And welcome back for another Strength Chat episode. Today, I have got a very special guest for you all. Today, I'm joined by a researcher. He's a lover of all things science, all things muscle, and cooking. Today, I'm joined by the one and only Max Coleman. How are you doing?
I'm doing so good, man. Thank you so much for having me. By the way, that's the best introduction I think I've had on any podcast that I've been on so far. So well done.
I'm always wanting to go. Do you know like the ring announcers? If I ever stop coaching or do anything like that, I think I might go into
I
that.
think you have a future in the WWE, man.
Yeah, I never made it as a wrestler, so a ring announcer will do me. But how are you, Max? What's been happening in your world? What have you been up to recently?
I'm super good, man. So for those of you who don't know me, I have my master's. I finished my master's under Dr. Brad Schoenfeld at Lehman College in May of last year. So I kind of just driving right into it. I hope that's all right.
Yeah, yeah.
But for the last year or so, I've kind of stepped a little bit away from academia, still very much involved in the scientific process. I've been involved in a couple of papers since leaving Lehman, but I've been spending a lot more time in kind of the industry side of things, kind of taking my hand at content creation as well as just personal training and online coaching as well, which has been really, really fun doing that as opposed to, because, from the time you're four in the United States until, well, at least for me, until the time I was 25, I was in graduate program. So I was in school for that entire period, right? So it's nice to kind of have a step away from that. And I absolutely plan on going back and getting my PhD within a year or so. But having spent this last year kind of in industry and actually making money as opposed to spending money on education has been really, really nice. So things have been going really well for me. Thank you for asking. I hope you have also been well.
Yeah, yeah, really, really good. Yeah, so kind of my probably since October, November last year, my role has kind of like changed at the gym. So I changed gyms a couple of years ago, and yeah, got a new role, and then my role's changed a little bit. So now, still doing still coaching in person, doing online coaching. But actually the my full-time role is training the other trainers at the gym that I'm at, which is pretty cool.
That's
A
super
little
cool,
bit of a
man.
change to what I've done before. Obviously, trying to speak to how can I get this person to do this exercise or X, Y, or Z, to then be like, how can I then get this person to then tell that person how to do that? So pretty cool. But yeah, a slight change in my role. How have you found? Do you kind of miss the academia side of things? How have you found that transition? Because, like what you say, if going from, I can imagine, something pretty full on to then trying to do all the other areas. How have you kind of found that?
So it's been nice. I can't say fully that I've just stepped away from academia, right? Because one, I've still been involved in several papers that have come out, as well as some like direct research that's come out since graduating. And I was involved. I was teaching at the university or at Lehman, which we can't call a university. Calling something a university has very specific meaning here in the United States. But I was teaching at the college in which I graduated from, so I was still very much involved in academia. And it's been so I can, and also even if I wasn't doing that at all, right? I'm still involved in like a very science-based, evidence-based type of education where I'm basically disseminating research. So even though I'm stepping away from academia, it's still like academia is like a huge part of not only who I am, but what I do as well. So it's been nice, but I can't say that it's been like a stark transition
Right. Okay.
away from
Cool.
doing it. It's nice not having to turn in assignments on Blackboard and stuff like
Yeah.
that. But aside from
Yeah.
that, hasn't really been much different at all.
All right, cool. And with one of the questions I like to ask, especially from, a bit of background to yourself, how did you kind of get involved in training, go down the route of, academia? And one of my favorite questions is who's kind of been your influences? And obviously, working under Brad Schoenfeld, but yeah, who's kind of like influenced your approach to training or having that interest within, muscle building and all those sorts of things.
Yeah, so I got into so even though it might look like I've never stepped foot in a gym in my entire life, I actually got into training pretty young. I got into lifting when I was about 12 years old. And for the same reason that like 99% of dudes get into training, I just delved. I saw the Wolverine movie and I was like, oh shit, I want to look like that. So I need to start going to the gym. And then it just basically almost upon like almost immediately became like a huge vocation of mine. I fell in love with it immediately. And that passion, fortunately for me, has not dissipated at all since then. And then, like all other Gen Z kids, basically got super into something, went to YouTube to learn as much as I possibly could about that subject, and fell folly to all of the individuals that you normally do, right? I loved the Buff dudes. I loved Elliot Holst, the Hodge twins, like all Scooby, like real throwback for those of you who know. Like I loved all of it, and I just tried to absorb as much as I possibly could. But I would say that the influences that have had the biggest impact on me and who I am today, obviously, are like the science based ones that you probably are already thinking of: the Greg Knuckles, the Eric Trexlers, the Mike Israels, the Eric Helms, all the Erics. And then more recently, obviously, like Dr. Pack and Milo have kind of influenced my way of thinking in like a more modern sense, as well as how they've kind of informed how I do some of my own content. And then shout out Daniel Plotkin, who's on the up and up as far as like research dissemination and influences are concerned. So those have definitely been the people that have had the biggest influence on me with respect to how I go about disseminating scientific information, and who have informed the most about how I kind of go about training in general. And then of course, yes, Dr. Schoenfeld, who hard to even call him an influencer, even though he's technically, I guess, on paper is. But he has had probably without question the biggest impact on not only how I train, but more importantly, how I go about thinking about training, and really even more broad, how I go about thinking in general. So
Yeah.
a big shout out to all of those guys, but a huge shout out to Dr. Schoenfeld for sure.
Yeah. And with that as well, just touching on kind of the I know obviously you've mentioned there about the science side of things and researching how because what I find really interesting is that so I read Mass every month, which comes out, and I recommend that to a lot of trainers. I actually recommend that to a lot of lifters as well because I think it's good to understand why something is. I think sometimes it's a case of they might do things and it's like, right, well, this is going to be a little bit of information surround it. What's it like actually being involved in those studies, making sure that everything is done correctly, and presenting those findings? Because I think sometimes for some people, maybe some coaches, they maybe find it sometimes challenging to digest that information, whereas being able to present it to be like, look, this is what's going to help with X, Y, or Z, if that kind of makes sense.
It absolutely is a really good question, and one I have actually never been asked before. So that's really cool. So it's going to take me a second to kind of like really fully articulate that. But I would say that the biggest difference between being a consumer of content and being a producer, their Apple goes trying to like that AI is so bad, and it's so bad. But the biggest difference between being like a consumer of science based content and being a producer of science is really coming to understand the limitations of what science is and can tell us as a lifter. Because when you're like consuming science based content, it's always very neatly packaged, which it needs to be because it needs to be neatly packaged so that it can reach the largest number of people, as well as it needs to be well packaged and very clean and boxed and oriented so that it's easy to digest. Right. But when you are actually in the trenches of creating research, you realize one, we don't know more than we don't even know. Like there's so many unknown unknowns. Like we obviously are aware of the things that we don't know, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of the limitations of the partial, like the range of motion research that we'll talk about here shortly. But there's so many unknowns that we don't even realize that we don't know, right? And when you're like actually in the trenches making science, you realize how dirty science is. And when I say dirty, I don't mean like, oh, we're over here manipulating, making up data and shit, which
Yeah.
I understand a lot of people will hear when I say that. But what I mean is like we're not in lab coats and sitting around like very neatly pouring chemicals into vials to make the perfect supplement or anything like that. No, it's really more so me sitting in a normal gym, which is the lab at Lehman where I did all of the research that I did in my master's, is just basically a gym because that's what labs look like in our field, right? With a couple of fancy things like dynamometers and BIA devices as well, right? But it's mostly just you sitting in a gym, training individuals, having headaches of trying to schedule 50 subjects to come in 3 days a week. Like you realize how not neat and not like perfect science actually is. So like I fell really folly to science-ism, which I don't know if any of your listeners would have ever heard of, or I'm sure they have, but like basically where you start to look at science as a deity to a certain extent, you start to not be able to see the limitations and pitfalls of what science can and cannot show us. And when you're actually involved in the process, you're like, oh, wow. Okay, so this is still the best tool that we have without question. I don't want people to take away from this that I'm dog shitting on science, right? Can I cuss on this podcast? I probably should have asked
Yeah,
that beforehand.
yeah.
But I'm not like I think science is the greatest thing ever, but it's just really important to not fall folly to like thinking like, oh, it is the perfect tool and it's the only thing that you need to inform decisions about training, right? So I would say that's the biggest thing that I learned was the limitations of science, which is a weird thing to say as someone who's in love with science, obviously.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I suppose a follow-up question from that one would be is, you mentioned there about, doing yourself doing coaching. How much kind of how much kind of flex do you kind of give from the knowledge that you've got from your science base to then what's presented as coaching? I know probably from my point of view, reading mass, looking at the content that you put out there, was lucky enough to chat with Dr. Park, which was an awesome episode. And it's like, yeah, we're not going. I felt reassured that I wasn't straying too far away from what it's saying, but how much kind of flex do you give in terms of, well, this is what it's kind of saying, but um, when it comes to the coaching side of things, it's that person in front of you who might be a different population, different training experience, all those other things. What's kind of your thoughts on that?
So science informs all of the decisions that I make with respect to program design and stuff like that, right? Meaning like when I'm starting a program, I put everyone on a very similar looking program, right? And let's get something very clear. I know this is the strength podcast, right? I am not a strength guy. I don't care about strength at all. I would much rather look like I can bench 225 than actually be able to bench 225. And most of my clients are the same way. They're coming to me mostly for body comp, like most Gen Pop people are looking for, right? To look like Wolverine in the Wolverine movie, right. So science is incredibly valuable to me, but it is nowhere near as valuable as personal anecdote. And I mean personal anecdote, and personal anecdotes not all created equal, right? So like someone's saying that they're just not going to try something because they don't want to, because it hasn't worked for them in the past, but they've never actually tried it before. Like that's not a valuable personal anecdote, right? But let's just take the range of motion. Or let's take a volume thing before, just because it's easier. Let's say that we know that generally speaking, you want to be somewhere between 12 and 20 sets, yada yada yada. Thank you, Baz at all. But let's say that you have someone who's like, look, man, I've tried 15 sets a week for X muscle, and I'm telling you, it does not work for me. I cannot recover workout to workout. That is so much more valuable to me than a meta analysis is, even, right? For that individual. So that's really important to keep in mind, right? And I think that's like the biggest misconception about what it means to be an evidence based trainer is that I'm going to have a PubMed article for every single training decision that I make, right? Which is just obviously not the case because this is a new field. Like exercise science as a discipline was invented in the 1960s, which 60 years old, 65 years old, that certainly doesn't sound young by any means. But let's compare that to biology. Let's compare that to math, which have been around for millennia, right? I've been around for and it like basically as long as humans have been around, right? So science is incredibly valuable, and I do use it to inform a lot of the decisions that I make with respect to training. But as long as you're adhering to some very basic principles with respect to muscle growth, which let's just name those, you're doing adequate volume, again, somewhere between 10 and 20 sets, but it's a big individual differences there, and you have to take that into account. Making sure that we're training hard, so we're getting at least somewhat close to failure, right? And we're using exercise that actually target the intended muscle that we're trying to stimulate, right? So for instance, we're not squatting for the hamstrings. If you're doing those three things, the rest of the program is kind of entirely up to whatever you want to do and whatever is going to keep your client training for the longest period of time, because that's what we're ultimately trying to do. One, it's good to, just from a business standpoint, we want to keep the people happy so that they keep paying us money to keep them happy, right? And to help keep seeing them progress or giving them progress with whatever goal they're trying to achieve. But also, we just want the world to be a more jacked, stronger place. And if we can do whatever it takes, as long as we're adhering to some basic principles and we can manipulate whatever other levers we want to keep people happy in training, That's all that really matters. So yes, science is incredibly important to me, but understanding what are actually the boulders that science has shown us, making sure that those are in order, the sand that we then fill in with the rest of the pot or whatever analogy we want to use, that's completely up to you and your client, and hopefully some combination of conversations between you and your client that'll inform training decisions.
Yeah. I really like that as as an analogy because I think sometimes the definition that you've said there or an explanation there, I think sometimes it gets muddied a little bit. People try and overcomplicate it, whereas the principles that you've mentioned there, alongside that, then you can play around with other things. But you need to get the I don't know whether it's the basics or the fundamentals, but those main areas, those boulders like that you mentioned, and then you can start playing around with this. Whereas I think sometimes, especially going back to some of the trainers that I've worked with, they want to jump the gun a little bit, and then they wonder why their clients aren't getting jacked, aren't getting strong, aren't progressing from there. And I think that goes on to, I know you mentioned earlier from the topics that I sent over of something that has come up recently from chats with clients, but also trainers and coaches is range of movement, range of motion when it comes to exercises. And what I find really interesting about this is I train predominantly Gen Pop members, but then myself competing in powerlifting, train quite a lot of powerlifters. But most people's goals when they're coming in are they want to lose a little bit of fat, but they want to gain muscle, and look like Wolverine. So in terms of a range of motion, when it comes to training, I just kind of wanted to get your definition or explanation on what the purpose of that is. Why does range of movement matter, and where does it become more important, dependent on muscle growth or strength or getting the most out of that exercise, if that makes sense. I know there was
Yep.
kind of like a couple of things there.
No, it was great. It was good. Yeah, and there's a lot to address. So I guess I'll start with the end, and then you'll have to like keep me on track to make sure I don't be too tangential, right? But with respect to when it's more important, I would say that range of motion is always equally important, regardless of the individual. And the reason I say that is because any training decision that we ever make it all has to be predicated on the principle of specificity, right? So, for instance, a power lifter, if you're only ever doing length and partials because you want to get jacked, you're going to really suffer from that when it comes to competition day because you have never practiced the lockout on the squat, bench, or deadlift, right? Those are the three movements you guys do in powerlifting, right? No, I'm
Yeah.
joking. I at least know that much. So like, yeah, of course, range of motion is predicated on the specificity of the goal that you're trying to achieve, right? So powerlifters, look, I'm sorry, you're going to have to train through a full range of motion for at least part of your training cycle, right? Especially when you get closer to competition date, we're really going to want to make sure that we're actually lifting through the ranges of motion that we care about. And then with respect to muscle growth, slightly contentious for some fucking reason that I don't understand. But yeah, I am on team length and partials. If nothing else, I'm on team long muscle length. So I think that, and we can delve into the difference between those two. But for those of you who don't know, length and partial is obviously just where you perform the generally anywhere from the first third to the first 2/3 of a range of motion. So we'll just call it the first half of a range of motion when the muscle is in its longer length as opposed to its shorter length or resting length, right? So I would say that is also pretty important for muscle growth. It's obvious. It's not a boulder. It's not one of the three things that I mentioned earlier. It's not volume, intensity, or exercise selection. But I guess it could technically fall under exercise selection depending on how you. It doesn't matter. But it's still very important. And if you look at the data that we have, which is around 4 or 5 studies, depending on how you classify certain things, because we have some that are preprints that haven't actually been published, and then we have some that are technically longer muscle length, but not exactly length and partials. And we have some, it doesn't matter. So around 5 studies where you're comparing a full range of motion to a length and partial, right? And almost all of them, except for one, which is a pretty weird one in of itself. It's like concentric only training. It's also a very, very small range of motion. So it's like a tiny length and partial. It's not even the first third of an exercise. They saw similar growth between groups. The rest of them tend to favor length and partials over a full range of motion for muscle growth, right? And that would not be the most, it's still pretty convincing. Like if I was a bet man, I'm putting my money on length and partials for muscle growth. But if that was the only literature we had on length and partial or on long muscle length training in general, that wouldn't be the most convincing thing in the world. But because we have so many other studies that are also not comparing full range of motion to length and partials, but comparing some sort of shortened length training to some sort of long length training. And almost all of them are in favor of long length training. And we can break down that a little bit further if you want. But how am I doing as far as answering the actual question that you asked? Because
Yeah, yeah.
I'm on a tangent here.
No, no. I think we've because looking at that, I know working through full range of movement, the parcels that you've mentioned there. When it comes to actually, the training stimulus and this thought process of you can cut the range of movement, or you're just going to work one particular part of the muscle. Where do you think that comes from? Because when you've kind of mentioned that in terms of the research showing the results that it gets, why do you think people sometimes always want to go through not full range of movement, or change it around, or change the different types of exercise to actually feel as though they're getting muscle growth?
Why do I think that people want to use a partial range of motion? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, just because the research is relatively convincing. So, like I said, we have about, depending on how you classify it, like five-ish studies comparing a full range of motion to a partial range of motion, and almost all of them, except for one, and remember that one is like kind of a weird use case, but almost all of them favor a partial range of motion. And then you just said something interesting there, which is how do we manipulate like the exercise maybe
yeah,
to be more length and bias? There's a lot of ways we can do that as well. So one study that's really interesting compared the incline curl to the preacher curl, right? The incline curl, for those of you who don't know, you're putting your arm behind you, which then lengthens part of the bicep, so that you would think, oh, that must be the better choice. But if you actually look at the resistance curve of that exercise, it's really easy in the lengthened position, and then it gets harder and harder as you go up, and then eventually it gets easier as you go up further, right? So like at 90, it's the hardest, and then as you go up, it's easier. But this range is actually really easy. And they compared that to a preacher curl like this, where this part of the exercise where the biceps are lengthened is the most challenging. And that one actually grew more than the incline curl. So you can actually manipulate exercise selection and exercises that you do without actually doing a lengthened partial. And you can make them what I have deemed pseudo lengthened partials, right? So you look at something like a dumbbell fly or a dumbbell pullover, right? Those are not, and you can do them through a full range of motion, but the resistance curve is incredibly, let's take a dumbbell fly, incredibly challenging here, and then gets easier and easier as you get towards the top, right? Which makes it like, to a certain extent, a pseudo lengthened partial, right? So there are a lot of ways you can manipulate exercises to theoretically and in some instances empirically tested improve the amount of hypertrophy that you're getting. And to kind of like directly answer the question of why do people want to do this, I think that in resistance training in general, more than other hobbies, it seems like people are always looking to optimize or like maximize the results that they get from their investments, right? Their return on investments, because like this shit kind of sucks. Like I love lifting more than the next guy, unless the next guy is like another weirdo in my field. But at the end of the day, like we are like kind of torturing ourselves. Like there is something somewhat masochistic about what we do in the gym. You know what I mean? And I think that given that this shit kind of sucks at the end of the day, like even though we all have this weird love for it, we want to at least make sure that the thing that we're doing to torture ourselves is giving us the best benefit that we can possibly get from it, right? So I think that because there is like pretty convincing empirical research to suggest that long muscle length training is more beneficial and more hypertrophic than short muscle length training or even just neutral muscle length training, I think that most people are going to try and veer towards that to make sure that they're getting the most they can out of this weird self masochistic torture thing that we all love doing.
And then from there, because like what you mentioned about the volume sets of the client that you're working with, I'm basing it on that client, flipping it onto like the coach's point of view, and we mentioned there about manipulating exercises. Sometimes if people aren't progressing, because sometimes it does happen. I do think a big believer in training and coaching is problem solving. How can it be? How can we get the best for that person? Do you think sometimes where either progress or growth slows down is sometimes the trainers or coaches not being aware or have the knowledge, like what you mentioned about the two different curls, to be able to be like, right, okay, this is what we're going to change to give that to be able to elicit a little bit more progress? Or do you think it's a case of they're not picking up on those things quick enough to make those changes, if that makes sense?
Yeah, man, I mean that's hard because like I said, most of my clients are not strength oriented. You can it's pretty easy to tell if you're not progressing if you're like a strength oriented athlete, right? Like if your numbers aren't going up and like your RPE isn't going up or whatever it may be that you're like tracking, it's pretty clear that like we're not making progress. Muscle growth is a lot harder to track, like a lot harder to track, especially if you're someone who goes through like cyclical bulking, cutting phases, whatever it may be. Um, Rep performance can be a proxy for like, are we actually building muscle? Like you did 225 for 8 last year. Now you're doing it for 12. Like, can we be sure that you're actually growing muscle? Maybe, but we're not entirely sure. So I think that actually knowing if you're progressing is a really complicated conversation in of itself, right? Obviously, we want to make sure that performance is going up, but there are some things that hurt performance that actually still grow more muscle, right? So, for instance, like I hate to keep talking about like long muscle length training, but like leaning further forward on a hamstring curl machine probably is better for muscle growth, but you aren't going to be able to lift as much weight on it, right? So like that's going to be hard to like you can't always use performance as a proxy for if we're growing. I would say that, yeah, man, this is going to sound really pompous and really like holier than thou, but like, yeah, man, most trainers are, they're meatheads. And so are we at the end of the day. Like, we're just meathead bros who like love lifting and just happen to find that like science is probably our best tool for answering lifting based questions and almost all questions, obviously. But like most people aren't that way. So I would say that like, man, like if you go to a gym, like your average gym where you just look at what trainers are doing, like, man, they don't know what they're doing 9 times out of 10, which is like I said, I understand how pompous and like douchey and ivory tower academia this is coming across as, and I do apologize, but like I think it's just the truth. I think that like I think that there's if you see someone's progress stall in the gym, it is likely that there are trainers out there that probably don't know which levers to pull to kind of continue pushing progress forward, whether that be increasing volume, decreasing volume, changing exercise selections, variations, whatever it may be. There's a lot of levers there to pull. But again, we come back to the beginning where it's like, do we really know that this person isn't actually progressing, or are they just unhappy with their results because they heard on Instagram that they should be gaining 12 pounds of muscle in every 6 months that they're lifting? You know what I mean? So I think actually knowing whether or not your client is progressing is kind of the first step there. And there are ways to go about tracking that, which we can get into, but it is challenging.
Yeah. And with that, because and especially touching on like the muscle building side of things, like what you say with strength, that is a lot more you can judge by the numbers going up, RPE going down, which a lot of people like, whereas especially, for Gen Pop clients, for the lifters that are training who are maybe in an off season, who maybe want to go up a weight class or anything like that. How do you kind of track their progress in terms of muscle because the or growth? Because like what you said there, the best exercise, you might not actually be lifting that much load. And everyone's mindset goes to, well, surely I need to be lifting really heavy. I need to be like what you mentioned about in the gym and you're seeing the trainers and it's like, no, put more weight on the bar, do more reps.
Yep.
What's kind of your approach and what have you found to have more kind of success in terms of being able to see our clients actually growing?
Yeah, I mean, this is such a shitty answer, but it's the truth. I mean, like, we're playing a visual game here. Like, even if actually tracking muscle growth, unless you have access to things like ultrasound, MRI, even like if you're using DEXA, that can be beneficial, but it's not perfect. Obviously, there's circumference measurements in conjunction with like skin fold testing. There's all kinds of things we can do, but literally none of that shit matters if the person isn't improving the way that they look in the mirror, on stage, in selfies for Instagram, whatever it may be. So and obviously like yes, if the person is lifting more with like the traditionally thought of like hypertrophy ranges, like if their 10 rm bench press has gone up 50 pounds, like we can be relatively confident that at least some of that is coming from like morphological adaptations, right? And like morphological adaptations that we care about in respect to, they got bigger,
Yeah.
for lack of a better term. But really, like progress pictures are the goat as far as like actually tracking whether or not someone's growing from like and obviously I'm referring to like an ecologically valid setting. Like it's not the goat because there's things that you can do to like influence the way that someone looks in a photo, obviously. But Alberto Nunez, I believe it's Alberto Nunez at Team 3DMJ, has like a really good course on like how to go about taking progress pictures, which sounds silly, but given that I think that it's one of the most valuable ways you can actually assess progress in the sport of bodybuilding and in the sport of lifting for hypertrophy in general, like it might actually be worth taking that course if you're someone who's like looking to train people for the purposes of bodybuilding or just muscle growth in general. So long-winded there, but progress pictures in the same lighting in a very standardized way are probably the best way of assessing whether or not someone's actually growing or not. And here's the kind of caveat steel man to that is, do we actually know if someone's growing just because they're looking better in pictures? No, of course not. Body fat has a huge influence on that. But like I said, we're talking about standardization. So I'm not going to talk about lighting or angles or anything like that because we're always assuming that we're taking the pictures in the same way at the same time of day and stuff like that. But there's a lot of ways to influence the way that someone looks in a photo that aren't necessarily indicative of true, genuine, like myofibril, like muscle growth, obviously. But then my counter to that is who fucking cares? Because, like, again, we're playing a visual game. Most people come to me wanting to look like Chris Hemsworth. I don't think they really care if their cross sectional area has increased by 30% if they're looking better in these photos. You know what I mean? So, again, long-winded progress pictures are probably your best way of assessing whether or not you're actually growing from the training that you're doing.
No, I think that's good because why speaking to you, we've already spoken about the science side of things. Ultimately, if you want him to look better, like what you mentioned there, look as though you can bench X amount of pounds rather than doing that. If their end result when clients are coming in, they want to get that end result.
For those of you just listening, the reason that we're laughing is because I'm sitting here absolutely still, not budging, and all of a sudden Apple thinks that I want balloons to fly up around me. Sorry about that, man.
It's all right. I like it. I thought it was just like a celebration. You should have saved that for the end of the episode.
I have no control over it. It's completely up to Tim Cook whether or not the emojis just start popping up on my screen, apparently.
uh, yeah, with that, people just want that end result. And even though, speaking about, training range of movement and the actual programming principles, it's that end result that we want to aim for, because I think going back to what might be confusing for a lot of trainers, a lot of coaches, is that they want to be able to know exactly if they're growing. And I think sometimes what I quite like to ask clients is like, well, how do you feel? How do you look? Yeah, I feel awesome. I look great.
How are
Cool.
your shirts fitting
Yeah.
versus like how your pants are fitting and stuff like that. I know, being the science guy that I am, the person who's like very left brained and loves numbers and baking and stuff like that. You would think that I'd be like, well, actually, the best way to test. Hold on. Well, actually, the best way to test whether or not you're growing is through some biopsies that we can do, and we can literally test the size of the myofibrils. But like, one, no one's actually going to do that, and two, like that might not even be beneficial to you if all we truly care about is how you look. And again, like you were saying, like those more subjective things of like, how are you feeling? Like, how did that weight feel while you were doing it for the same number of reps you did months before? How are your clothes fitting? Like stuff like that is like far more valuable to me than like your DEXA came back at a different X, or DEXA is not a great analogy there because DEXA is relatively robust, but like your bathroom scale that measures your body fat percentage told you that you were fatter or leaner. Like, I don't give a shit about that. Especially if it doesn't comport with more subjective things like, yeah, my shirts are fitting better around my arms, but are feeling looser around my stomach and stuff like that. Like,
Yeah.
as silly as it may sound, that is more valuable to me.
Yeah. And do you think when we've spoken about using science and research, and mentioned there, how much flex do you kind of give, is that where trainers and coaches, people just training, can use that as, look, this is what's gonna from a physiology standpoint is going to allow that change, and then the other half is right. Well, I'm going to apply those things and then use the more maybe subjective uh, principles of clothes fitting, photographs and those sorts of things. Do you think that's the right balance and approach to have a look at kind of like both areas?
You need both. Like you, and I think that this is where people conflate science versus non-science. Like these are all evidence-based takes that we have, right? They're just based on the best evidence that we have, and we don't always have empirical evidence to inform training decisions, right? But we have anecdotal experience, we have that of expert opinion. So, like for instance, like an individual telling, like a bodybuilder, right? Someone who's been in the game for a really long time telling me something about their training experience, especially for that person, is more valuable and is better evidence for that individual than your average like PubMed article, right? That's done on a particular population of individuals, yada yada yada, with a bunch of controls in a lab setting that you don't see in the real world. There are certain things that you can't flex on, though, right? There are certain like scientific principles that like I hate to say that I don't allow for any flex, but like if you come to me or flexibility, and if you come to me and you're like, I want to get as jacked as possible, like there are some things that are just like we have to do. Like we have to train hard. We have to train relatively close to failure. I'm not saying that we have to train balls to the wall, Mike Mentzer, Dorian Yates style or anything like that, but we got to train hard. We're going to have to do a sufficient amount of volume. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be 12 to 20 sets for that individual, but it's going to be probably higher than they want to intuitively, right? Because like that shit sucks, but like you're going to have to train probably more than you want to if you want to maximize the size of your muscles, right? And then we have to actually do exercises that target the muscles we're trying to hit. Like at the end, like your triceps are never going to get as big as possible if you just rely on pressing movements for growing the triceps. Like if you're only benching and overhead pressing and you're thinking that that's going to grow your triceps as much as possible, you're just wrong. And we have pretty good empirical evidence to like to support that training decision, right? So there's a ton of flex. There's a ton of flex with a ton of variables that we do in training, but there are some that you just can't flex on. And like we can even talk about like dieting, right? Like can you eat M&Ms and Pop Tarts and get shredded for summer? Absolutely, but you have to be in a caloric deficit. Like you're going to have to be eating less than you're produce. Like you're going to have to eat less than you produce, like energy wise, right? If you want to like lose weight, but there are like a trillion different levers that we can pull to get you to achieve that goal. So tons of flexibility on a lot of things, on most things, but no flexibility on a very few number of things, on a very small number of things, if that makes sense. I don't know if that like directly answers the question that you were asking.
Yeah, no, I think with those things is that um I think everyone's always looking for a clear cut answer, and it's black and white. Whereas I think sometimes there is going to be shades of grey, because there are going to be exceptions to the rule. There are going to be some things where, like, yes, this is the case, but like what you say, we do need a little bit of flex. Whereas the things, what I really liked is, when you said about, the parameters to work between, get those set, and then we can adjust them as we go. The other thing I wanted to touch on in terms of when we mentioned there about, look, people are coming in for muscle growth. There's got to be, a certain amount of effort, hard work, volume in there, and maybe you can help trying to debunk some of the myths. But there's quite a lot of different intensity strategies, drop sets, all those sorts of things. Um, when it comes to muscle building, when it comes to actually growth. And I think sometimes, from programs I've seen, from people I've seen in the gym, they kind of throw all these things, out there. And for me, it's a kind of a case of see what sticks. But if there's so many things going on there, what do you know what actually works? So in terms of muscle building intensity strategies, what works? What is it that like what we've said about the principles from there? What's going to allow the most growth to happen? Or is it a case of you can cycle through a couple of those and try different things?
Yeah, I mean, so we know so I don't want to speak too confidently, but we know what works. And the only thing about those intensity techniques, like all the ones you named, drop sets, whatever, supersets, blood flow restriction training, myo reps, all of these different intensity techniques, they all still adhere to the principles that we know work, right? So as long as your whatever fun new insert influencer X's name, blah, blah, blah's technique that you're doing, as long as it adheres to certain principles, you can be pretty confident that it's going to work, right? Now, we do have to be a little bit more empirical. We do have good research on drop sets. Certainly, we have too much research on blood flow restriction, to be quite honest with. Like, I don't know why that's like the golden goose that people keep researching, but we have tons of research on that. We have some research on supersets with another really cool paper dropping soon by Ryan Burke et al. So shout out to the homie. That's a really cool paper that's coming out, and they all work. And I don't have any issue with. So when I was, sorry, I'm kind of rambling here. When I was younger, I was like, why do any of them? They all, like, according to the research that we have, they all produce, because like we have research on supersets, we have research on drop sets, we have research on blood flow restriction, we have research on rest pause and myo reps and stuff like that. And almost always they come back saying it's the same as doing straight sets. So why, like, and when I was younger, I was like, why bother? If it's the same thing, and why even bother doing it? Being the like unbelievably lame person I am that only enjoys like watching movies and lifting, basically, and cooking. I don't need to like
Literally summed up my whole weekends there.
yeah, exactly. So like I don't need to like make training interesting, but most of the world is not like you and me, right, man? Like especially within context of like being a trainer and a coach, like you got to do shit to keep these people entertained. And like at the end of the day, like straight sets, as great as they are, they get boring after a while for a lot of people. So I have no problem with trainers throwing a bunch of stuff at the wall and like letting it stick. The only thing you don't want to do is like show all your cards and then they get bored of all your cards immediately. Kind of like let them have fun with certain things. Like maybe we do drop sets every once in a while this month. The next month, we'll do a bunch more blood flow restriction stuff. And then we'll do a bunch of supersets and stuff the next month. Right. And they're like, I don't think that there's any reason not to, especially if you're someone who's like short on time. These intensity techniques can be incredible. So like there's a good bit of drop set literature now showing that you get the same amount of growth with like around half or less than half the amount of time. This recent paper that just dropped was this, it's literally called less time, same gains, or something like that, is like the hook of the title, which is great that we're doing that in exercise science. We're starting to actually make the titles of papers more interesting.
Yeah.
But like they found, I believe, that like in 36% less time, you get the same amount of gains if you use something like a superset, like an antagonist agonist superset. So that's great. But even if you're someone who's not trying to save time, but you want to squeeze in as much volume. So like, let's say that you have like an hour and a half to train, which is like a long time for the average person to have in a day to actually exercise, right? Fortunately, you and I like work in a gym, so we probably can spend as much as like 3 hours a day lifting if we wanted to, because we can just split that up across the day. Most people don't, right? But let's say that you have an hour and a half to train. You can still squeeze in, theoretically at least, more volume by doing certain intensity techniques. Like you're going to be able to do a lot of like way more sets if you're doing drop sets and supersets to fill up that time that you have in the gym, which theoretically, because of the somewhat clear relationship we have between volume and hypertrophy, will ultimately lead to more growth, right? In the same amount of time, right? So I think that these techniques shouldn't be written off as just like, oh, they're the same as straight sets, so why even bother doing them? Because they're pretty great, especially for individuals trying to save time and individuals trying to maximize the gains that they can possibly get without spending just hours upon hours in the gym every week. Like we don't want to be in the gym for 15, 16, 17 hours a week, right? But if we can get a ton of gains being in the gym for 10 to 12 hours a week, and that's a long time too, don't get me wrong, but that still seems like a great choice for a lot of people. And sorry, last thing I'll say with respect to something like blood flow restriction, there might be something actually particularly hypertrophic about blood flow restriction, right? So we have some evidence, loose, not necessarily convincing by any means, but some evidence to suggest that there might be some type 1 specific hypertrophy when doing blood flow restriction. So for those of you who don't know, your muscles are comprised of different muscle cells. So we call those, your muscle fibers are muscle cells. and they are either type 1 or type 2 or some transitionary fiber. But right now, we'll just talk about type 1 and type 2, right? Generally, type 2 fibers seem to grow better and more than type 1 fibers, but there's some evidence, again, limited and not super convincing, that blood flow restriction might be beneficial for type 1 fibers, right? And there's also some reason to believe, like, not really, this isn't very empirically supported or anything, that like higher rep sets might be better for type 1 fibers or whatever it may be. Anyway, I think blood flow restriction and like other kind of intensity techniques should be a part of your program if you're trying to maximize muscle growth outside of the time aspect that we've been talking about, because there might be some particular mechanism, even if it's not type 1 specific, there might be some particular mechanism that is unique to higher rep sets and to like hypoxic environments in general. So I don't think that they should be written off. And if you're trying to like absolutely get as big as you possibly can, they actually probably should be in your routine.
Yeah.
Very long-winded, very rambly there. I apologize, but I
No,
hope
I
that
think
like kind
the
of answered your question.
Yeah, I think the what I really liked from there, especially there was actually a couple of clients that were running through my head when you mentioned that, using these strategies to get the most in amount of time. Because realistically, I know we've touched on general population quite a lot. They want to get results, but everyone's busy. They're not going to have times. They might work 9 to 5. I know a lot of my clients travel with work as well. How can we get the most as we can or more done within that hour, within that 45 minutes? I've got some clients training for, and I think sometimes from people who don't have that good understanding, whether it be just people who are just getting involved in training, or even some trainers just not understanding where we can use them, so they don't understand them, so they don't use them, or they just think, oh well, this is good, and then just using them, with not effectively, or sometimes, well, hear your thoughts. Using it on exercises that aren't gonna be able, they're not gonna get the most out of it, as opposed to some other exercises, which is then ends up being a waste of time because they're not going to be able to get as much from there. What are kind of your thoughts on that? Being able to use those strategies for the right exercise, but then also I know you've mentioned there, use them. They are going to produce results, but is there a point where doing too much of that all the time can be detrimental to result, maybe from a recovery standpoint, or a longer term standpoint, if that kind of makes sense, for those two questions?
Yeah, so there definitely are certain exercises that are better suited to like intensity techniques, right? Like for instance, you're probably not going to do a drop set on squats or something like that. It's probably not your best bet, as far as like you might get crushed, and also like the amount of time that it takes to take off the plates between sets and stuff like that can be kind of annoying as well. So always choose exercises that aren't going to crush you when you fail. If you're trying to do these intensity techniques, that's a really important thing to say. Do I think there's like a time course? Probably not. I can't imagine a reason why there would be. So, like for instance, there's at least one drop set paper that was 12 weeks long. And look, 12 weeks is nothing compared to the 12 years that like you and I probably have been training, right? But if we don't see any disparity in growth in 12 weeks, like I can't imagine why there would be some mechanism of action that causes like a detriment to the growth response you see from certain intensity techniques. And of course, that's just drop set training specifically that I can speak to there. Um, there RPEs tend to be higher with certain intensity techniques. Like I know drop sets have seen somewhat higher RPEs. Drops or supersets have seen somewhat higher RPEs in acute studies. Drop sets certainly have seen higher RPEs. Blood flow restriction, same thing. You tend to see like higher. Like people think that the thing is harder, even though it doesn't actually. That doesn't actually make it any more effective. So there might be some degree of like psychological burnout there. But I can't think of a reason why you would be like doing too much of an intensity technique. Like, and maybe there's someone far smarter than I am that can tell me why that's silly. And there actually is such a thing as too much of an intensity technique. But aside from like psychological burnout from just perceiving the thing to be more difficult than traditional training, I can't see a reason why you shouldn't be doing that in perpetuity or anything. Now, like I said, there might be when we're talking about like understanding how muscles actually grow, we're kind of like not there yet. We don't really have a very clear picture of how muscles actually grow. So there might be something particularly hypertrophic about traditional sets and like heavy, hard training, right? In the 5 to 15, 5 to 12, whatever rep range. So we definitely shouldn't only be doing like intensity techniques because, again, we might be limiting the amount of hypertrophy that we could actually be achieving because we're not pulling the other mechanisms that might exist. But again, all theoretical, all conjecture. I cannot give you an empirical reason why you shouldn't only do like certain intensity techniques as your style of training.
Yeah. Yeah, with that, I'm saying, there's no reason why not to do it. I think, when it talks about, because ultimately it's going to come down to like what we said right at the beginning, you've got those main principles, and then it's a case of part of that is being able to actually train with intensity, train with effort. And I think sometimes this maybe is a little bit of a tangent, but people maybe sometimes shy away from that and then wonder why they're not progressing. Whereas actually, like what you've said there, all the way through this chat, there's certain things that we want to hit. I really like the analogy of like pull the different levers to be like, right, this is what we need to get to, because sometimes you do need to you know think about, right, well, actually I'm going to pull this one, see how this one goes, and then stop from there, which I think from a coach's and a trainer's point of view is a useful analogy to think about and be like, look, you've got all these tools available. This is what it's, to be able to give you an informed decision of what can work. And like what you've mentioned, there's nothing there, nothing substantial to say, look, we don't have to use that, because I think a lot of things, and why it's been really interesting speaking today is, there's I think a lot of thought processes is down to just people's opinion. And it's just, okay, yes, so, oh no, so this isn't going to work. All right, well, what's your theory behind that? Well, so and so told me, or I haven't been able to use that as much, or what I kind of believe in is not being able to use these strategies effectively, and actually give them a long enough time to do it. Like what you mentioned there, 12 weeks. Yes, in the grand scheme of things, it isn't a big period of time.
It's
People
a
think
blip.
it's a long period of time,
Yeah.
but actually, you said right at the beginning, we want people to be training. We want the world to be a more jack strong place forever. We want people to train forever. Rather than be like, right, 12 weeks. Well, realistically, how much muscle are you going to gain in 12 weeks compared to how much muscle are you going to gain, in a year, 5 years, 10 years, training for that, which, for me, yeah, it's that patient side of things. People keep training because they enjoy it. They like going into the gym. But yeah, I think sometimes not having that effort, not using those tools available, is where people aren't going to see that progress. Um, Quite a lot of topics and a few tangents thrown in there. But the last question that I like to ask, Max, is from everything that we've chatted about there, whether it be people who are just maybe training themselves, just interested in training, coaches or trainers who are working with clients, what would be your take home points or words of wisdom?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to sound like a broken record, but whether you're just someone who's training, generally speaking, or you're someone who's like actually trying to be an IFBB pro, it's important to remember that science is the best tool that we have for answering questions of any kind, especially something as objective as muscle growth and as objective as like increases in strength and conditioning of any kind, right? But there is science has also shown us that there is a ton of leeway with respect to what you can do to achieve whatever goal it is in fitness that you have. And as long as you're adhering to some very basic principles, you can do a lot of different fun techniques to keep yourself in the gym and to keep yourself getting more and more jacked throughout life. So make sure you're training hard, make sure you're training enough, whatever that means for you, and make sure you're using exercises that actually target the muscles you're trying to achieve. If you do those three things, the rest that you do is not inconsequential, especially if you're that individual looking to get as jacked as possible. There are probably some things that you also kind of have to do to make sure that you're turning over every stone that you possibly can to get jacked. But especially if you're just a normal person, Like you do those three things, your own grandmother is not going to be able to tell the difference between you doing supersets or not, or doing blood flow restriction or not, or doing length and partials or full range of motion. So I think that's a good way of thinking about things. Like, is my grandmother going to be able to tell the difference between this deload paradigm and this deload paradigm over the course of the next 10 years? Who knows? So yeah, I think that's my biggest takeaway.
Nice. I think those 3 points, I might just get them printed out as just like three lines, put them up in the gym and be like, right, Max Coleman said this, so I think we can go
The
through that.
height of authority, Max Coleman.
Yeah. No, thanks a lot for taking the time to jump on today. I know obviously, a couple of topics in mind to chat about there, a couple of tangents, but no, I think some really useful information that I think sometimes, anyone involved in training, people just in the gym, coaches and trainers alike, just sometimes maybe forget or just don't fully understand or maybe overcomplicate it a little bit. Whereas what I really loved about that is, you know, you can get into the weeds of quite a lot of things, whereas actually, especially how you've explained it there, is look, this is what we're gonna work with. You can, pick and choose, but ultimately this is the foundation of what we're going to work from, which I think is, really helpful. If anyone has any questions about what we've chatted about today, or want to reach out and speak to you or see the content that you put out there, where can people find you or reach out to you, Max?
Yeah, for sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. You said thank you, so it's like the obligatory "I'm on someone's podcast" thing to do. No, but genuinely, one, it's like a huge honor that anyone would ever ask me to come on their podcast to talk about this stuff. So thank you. Two, I will take any and every opportunity to talk about lifting and getting jacked as I possibly can. And three, I'll take any and every opportunity I can to listen to someone with any British accent I can. So thank you so much for having me on, man. But yeah, if you ever want to talk about anything lifting, like I just said, I'll take any and every opportunity to do so. So just reach out to me on Instagram. That's like my primary social media use of sorts. It's Coleman et al. So COLEMAN.ET.AL. And that's on every platform. So I am on TikTok, I am on Instagram, I am on YouTube, at Coleman et al. So yeah, thank you so much.
Nice. No worries at all. Well, thanks again for taking the time to jump on. Thanks a lot to everyone listening, and I will see you all next week.